got to see a super heavy movie. So I just want to thank you for that. Because this film to me is so rich. It's such a rich character study. I'm so fascinated by this man. And to learn more about how you came to this man, what fascinated you about him. What did you think you could do with this film? Did your intentions play out differently as the filmmaking went on? My first the way we'll do this is I have to ask a few questions first, and I hope that they resonate with you all, and then we'll open it up to you guys. Okay? Does that sound good? Yeah, tell us about, I think one thing that people would like to know is the genesis of this film. I mean, we see Bowling for Columbine mentioned in this movie, and I don't know if you all know this, but Charlie was a producer of Bowling for Columbine with Michael Moore. And also, we get some other, there are also parts of your bio that resonate here. He was the producer of, will I say this word right? I don't know.
Religulous.
I'll
just say it. You just mouth the word,
okay.
And I'll fill in. Religulous.
Religulous,
Yeah.
And which was a fantastic film too that I enjoyed very much about, radicalism, about and politics. And so were those two films tied into your idea to make this film in some way? Where did this come from?
Okay, well, I first learned about the Anarchist Cookbook when I saw it on my cousin's shelf growing up in the suburbs in the late 70s, early 80s. I think that he had a copy of the book, as many young people do. I believe William Powell is right about this, that many people bought the book to piss off their parents. My cousin certainly did. It wasn't because he was building bombs in his kitchen. And it was just kind of it had sort of a cult status. It was dangerous. It was something to scare your friends' little brothers with, that sort of thing. So I was familiar with the book, and when we included it in Bowling for Columbine, I learned more about the legacy of the book, and I started to wonder whatever happened to the guy who wrote that book, and so it just had been a question that I had after that film, and wondered specifically what it would be like to have put something like that out into the world, and learned about its connection. I would see it come up from time to time associated with school shootings, and went back and sort of learned more about the legacy of the book. And I read a book by John Ronson more recently. John Ronson is a journalist and writer and does great podcasts. He wrote a book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which is about the more modern phenomenon of people publishing things, writing things, posting things on the internet, and losing control of how those things are perceived and the effect that they have. So there are many examples of this phenomenon of public shaming, and he documents them in the book. And when I read that book, it resonated for me with the Anarchist Cookbook, which to me it seems like William Powell is like an early test case of that. It's like, the the stories of people posting pictures of themselves doing things that they shouldn't, or saying things that they shouldn't on Instagram posts, and getting in trouble, losing jobs over those things, not being admitted to college as a result of something, that they say that crosses a line. And Bill Powell was sort of a very stark, early, pre-internet example of that, and it just seemed like there was a story there. He would have a story to tell, and I thought he'd be an interesting character. That was my instinct. And then I did, some research about him and approached him to see if he would be interested and available to talk to me.
And he said yes. Why did he? First of all, how did you approach him, and how did you meet him, and what did he think this film was going to do for him? How did you convince him to do this? I mean, this is kind of a tricky question. It's sort of a...
Yeah, I mean...
Was there any manipulation involved here? Did you have an opinion about all of this when you started, I guess is what I want to...
Well, of course, part of me wants to answer that there was no manipulation involved. There's nothing exploitative about the relationship between a documentarian and their subject. There's nothing that a journalist does to get a story that involves getting people to say and do things that they may wish they hadn't said and done. I'm sure you've never done that. But the other part of me wants to be perfectly honest and say that I think that there's something inherently manipulative, exploitative, to use, button-pushing words, about so much of storytelling, so much of journalism, documentary filmmaking, writing, if you're writing from true life, if you're writing from real life, if you're writing from experience and other people's stories. And so I think there is something, to use Machiavelli's, terminology, mutually exploitative about the relationship between a storyteller and their subject. William Powell wanted something from me. I wanted something from him. I wanted, at a minimum, a good story. And he wanted something along the lines of a chance to tell his story, and maybe some kind of redemption, or the ability to tell his story to a sympathetic audience. And so, now, just to back up, I contacted him, and it was, I think, fortunate timing. He was in his mid-60s. I think he had lived a long life and had kind of made his peace with the book, with its legacy in large part. He had written a couple public statements. I think he had gotten to a place in his own life where he was working on a memoir, so he was writing his own story, which he shared with me. And it was surprising to me to learn, reading his biography, how little he had to say about the book, actually. He talked about writing the book. He did tell the story about losing a job, where the book was circulated, and it nearly cost him a job. But other than that, he really didn't talk about the effect that the book had on his life, and I was struck by that, and intrigued. And I told him basically what I told you about John Ronson's book, that I was troubled by the stories of people who had made a sort of youthful mistake, said something in a moment of youthful exuberance, whatever, and it became a permanent part of their record. It was out there in a way that they couldn't take back. And I thought these stories, some of them were pretty heartbreaking, and I thought that it said something about us as a society, the desire to sort of pillory people, and I mean, public shaming is itself as much about the shamers as it is about the people who are being shamed. This desire to, have people who we can pull down and ridicule, I think says more about the internet culture than it does about, and our desire to kind of pull people down in that way, than it does about the dangers for all of our kids or whoever who might say something that would trip them up. And so I was interested in that, and I was interested in trying to tell the hopefully complex story about someone who was wrestling with the legacy of something that they had done, something in their past, and trying to make sense of it. And I sensed that Bill was someone who was, willing to go there. And the very first question that you see in the edit of the film was the first question that I asked him. It really was the first moment. And I was shocked to hear him say, that the book didn't advocate violence, just flatly deny that. And then to say that he hadn't read the book in decades, since the time he wrote it. So the man I encountered was someone very different from who I thought I might meet.
Wow. And so you were with him 4 days. Is that right? 4 days? And so this must have been, because of course, Charlie, if you noticed, is in the film too. He's another character. I mean, he's constantly there. He's constantly pushing, constantly confronting this man, what this man seems to me, watching it, has been running from, has been hiding from, has been in his, both physically, geographically, and mentally. He's walled off so much, which is the most fascinating part of the film for me, just the depth of this, how haunted he really is. So you're with him for 4 days. There's a moment when he gets angry, seems to run out of patience for this pushing that you're doing. You included it in the film, and yet some critics of the film have said you were too tough on this man, and I just kind of wondered how you're processing that.
Well, I would be a little curious, just by a show of hands, to know if people agree with that sentiment, that I was too tough on Bill. If people would put up their hands if they thought I was too tough. Okay, you guys are being very generous. I think. Well, I guess the question is, what is the purpose? What is the goal? What is the aim in telling this story? And it is the filmmaker's prerogative to tell the story that they want to tell. And as you say, Liz, I chose to include, I edited the film with an editor. I made choices about what to include. I interviewed Bill over the course of 4 days. The confrontation, the sort of more confrontational moments that are included in the film may or may not be the only ones that happened. They may or may not have been the most heated moments over the course of those 4 days. They could have been removed from the film entirely. It was a choice to include them. And so I think it's fair to ask, and we're getting into some sort of meta discussion a little bit, and maybe it's just not that interesting to people, you can tell me, what is, so what is the filmmaker doing exactly? And how do you make those choices about what to include in the film? Why include the confrontational moments? Or would I have been better served, would the story have been better served by leaving them out? One feeling I have about this sort of thing is that it's important for audiences to care about the character that is at the center of a film, to like that person on some level, to root for them, to identify with them, to try to understand them. I see that as my job in making a film about a person. I've made 2 films that are similarly about people, that are, I guess, a character study. This one and Finding Vivian Maier. And in both cases, I think, besides telling the story about this book and about the period, the late 60s, the early 70s, all of which is fascinating to me and worthy of many films, and there have been great films made about that period, protests and violence and the rest, political films. I'm interested in people, and so I was interested in this character and Bill Powell as a person, and so to me it's important that the audience like the character, and I see that as part of my job, is to figure out how to make that the case. And so having the audience feel that the filmmaker is on some level,
did you set
anything,
yourself?
I believe that anything that achieves that end, anything that helps the audience identify more closely with the character is to the good, is I guess how I will sort of address that. And so if I felt that my coming off as confrontational would be counterproductive to that, and it would not be in the film. I had a lot of people see versions of the film, earlier cuts of the film, where there was a lot more fireworks, I guess, and was told that I needed to pull it back significantly. So that answers the question about how much more there, back and forth there was. I didn't enjoy that part of the process. It was unpleasant. I was a guest in Bill's and Ochen's home.
You were
I didn't
there.
stay there, no. But I mean, I was invited to their home to do the interviewing, and the crew that I was with, and there was an understanding that there would be difficult questions, of course, but the process was not easy, and so I sort of, as Bill would say, I did what I did, and I didn't do what I didn't do. There were moments where he had to be drawn out, as you can see in the film, and where he was very resistant. But I think he did get to a place where there's something like closure, something like an acknowledgement of his responsibility, culpability, his sense that he has kind of taken ownership of his own actions, and that process of seeing someone sort of come to terms with their past, on film, I thought would be compelling, and so that was sort of the goal.
Fantastic.
I don't know how satisfying that is.
It's very satisfying. I could talk, but I wonder if there are questions out in the audience. I'm sure there are, and I want everyone to have a chance. Yeah, I think I'll start with you. Yeah, and I guess, what shall we do about the microphones? Shall I run around?
You can probably hear.
I
can repeat them if I.
Okay.
I can speak up loud. I've got a quick question. Just real quick. So the whole story is great. I love it. But you can really clearly see that he was, really disturbed with his decision to, I guess, capitalize on the book. And he was really remorseful. And then you play with irony throughout was great. I love that. And then, so my question is, you have perpetuated the book by sharing this movie, and therefore perpetuated, possible, children getting their hands on this because they see your movie. And so, it's kind of the irony here. Do you have any regret for sharing this?
Yeah. Did everyone hear the question? Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to give you a short answer to this one. It's something we can certainly talk about at more length. But my short answer is the journalist's cop-out answer, which is that when we report on or document bad things that happen in the world, of course there is always that notion that by shining a light on something awful, you might invite people to repeat those things or to do sort of copycat actions or something like that. There is also, and hopefully, the opposite effect, which is that by shining a light on very bad acts, on unfortunate events, on tragedies, you're doing the opposite of that, and you're preventing it, and you're asking people to be more vigilant, and you're showing the dangers that exist in the world, and you're not hiding from them. I hope that it's the latter, and I think like anyone would fear that it's the former, but I trust people enough to think that most people will, of course, see this as tragic and something to guard against, not as something to emulate. Yeah.
Did you consider it before you put this out?
Yeah.
So we have a question right here.
Charlie, I enjoyed the film, and the discussion was great. If you were to ask the first question you asked him at the end of the 4 days, what do you think the answer would have been? Or maybe you did that, and it was seems like he grew quite a bit over the.
Yeah, I think by the time he had. Sorry, the question is if I asked that first question that the book seems to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. I think he would agree. I mean, he basically agreed as soon as I asked him to then read the book that he hadn't read in decades. And so, yeah, I think he acknowledged. I think it was the sort of ostrich, defense: bury your head in the sand, hope it away, ignore it, wish it away. He says as much by the end of the film that he probably didn't look to see and learn about whether the book had been used by others because he didn't want to know the answer. And I think looking at the book himself, I think he was mortified by it, embarrassed by the rhetoric and the bad writing. But in particular, the advocating violence, which clearly it does. Yeah.
Another question here in the front row.
Yeah, thank you. I was sort of surprised that you said that you wanted us to like him, or that we should like him, because I found him dishonest, disingenuous. I didn't like him at all.
Okay.
Though I do think you brought him to some kind of realization, but I couldn't understand why he would even agree to talk to you. And if he was going to talk to you, he should have, a smart guy, anticipated the kind of questions you would ask. But he seemed very unprepared to answer so many of them.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I empathize with. I hear you that you find him unlikable. I find him human, and I empathize with him. Flawed. I think that if Bill were someone who had no regret, remorse, or however he wants to split those split hairs like that, if he was someone who was incapable of looking at his actions and questioning them, then I think he would be a monster or some kind of a sociopath, and I would not be interested in making a film about someone like that. That to me is not an interesting character. I'm not interested in true crime type stories that are about crazy murderers and things like that. I don't watch that stuff, and I'm not interested in those people. I am interested in human beings and people whose stories feel relatable, feel like maybe they're a bit in the extreme, as Vivian's is, and she's a brilliant artist, and Bill wrote a book that, in some ways, changed many, many lives and wreaked havoc on many lives, and he paid an extraordinary price for it. I think by the end of the film you see the price he paid. I think you see it in Ochen's description of their sort of self-exile, that she'd like to be back in New York. But I think if he was someone who seemed incapable of those sorts of emotions, I would find it hard to make a film about someone like that. I find him very empathetic, but I also understand, and I would say that's another one where audiences are quite split between people who find him sort of sympathetic and people who do not.
Right. I would just like to take another poll about who had deep sort of empathy with him in the audience. Yeah, I kind of did too. And so, yeah, it's just so curious that we can see this, and it's so open to our own interpretation, our own sort of mindset, our own fears about things we haven't acknowledged or have acknowledged, or, to me, this is just the most rich character. Let's have another question, yeah.
How do you sorry, I should
No,
know.
that's okay.
How do you determine what your emotional objection is? So, you're making a decision as you're creating this film of where to sort of toe the line emotionally with this individual, and at some point in time you have to sort of decide admission of guilt is what I'm trying to get out of him. So I would just be curious to kind of hear more about how you sort of got to your precipice of what am I trying to accomplish here?
Right. If everyone could hear that sort of, if I could paraphrase, I believe she was asking about the filmmaker's process of distilling down what it was that you were doing, threading a needle is something I like to say, in terms of telling a story, so that it includes the good and all the contradictions acknowledged.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's because it's partly about process, and it's partly about holding me accountable for what is it exactly that I'm up to in this film. And I think the honest answer is that one doesn't really know what the objective is, or shouldn't anyway, and should be open to what the subject is giving you. In particular, if you're making a film about a person and trying to kind of get inside their head and figure them out, you should leave room to be surprised. And I had the experience making this movie and Vivian Maier, where the story, the finished film, ended up being something completely different than what I set out to make. I thought I was making one kind of film about one kind of story, about one, with one kind of character, and it turned out to be something very, very different. And there are certainly surprises in this film. That finding Bill as reticent as he was a real surprise to me. I don't know what the film would have been if he hadn't been, because it ends up being this kind of, right, it kind of becomes about that. It kind of becomes about the chess match, or whatever it is that we're in, to kind of, explore the terrain of regret and remorse and culpability and responsibility, and what do these things exactly mean? I mean, I knew certain things that I wanted to ask about. I knew that he was aware of certain events where the book had been connected, and I knew that the book had affected him directly because he had written about it in his own memoir. These were very isolated moments and quite late in the process, like, pretty recent. And so what I was more curious about was, I don't know, how he managed to get that far along without, was it sort of willful ignorance? Was it, what was it? What does one do? What mental tricks does one play in order to suppress difficult stories from one's past in order to tell the story of your life? It's hard to carry around tragedies and adversity and stories that you're not proud of. And so what was that like for him to do that? How did it work? How did he manage to take the money all those years? What went through his mind in doing that? And I didn't necessarily know what would be a satisfying answer to those questions. I really did want to be, I didn't have an agenda in the sense that I was looking for him to issue some sort of new version of an apology, some new mea culpa or something. But I just wanted to understand what it had been like for him, and have him tell his story. And what I didn't anticipate was that it would be like, pulling teeth to get there.
Well, did you think it would reveal such personal tragedy? And I mean, it did the opposite of go away. It got worse, and it's still scary. It's still. But then when you find out about his. The abuse that he suffered, and the alienation that he felt, and what parallels there are between him and the school shooters, it's just the depth of the tragedy just yawns to me. Yeah. It's
And and he had such an opportunity, I thought, and you see him, sort of reaching out to Dianne Feinstein at that one point. It's like, you could imagine a world where Bill, he did wonderful things during his lifetime, and had an impact on people, on students who were like him, and I think that's a beautiful part of the story. I think, he could have reached even more people with his story, I think. If he had embraced the book in some way, I think he could have, I would have loved for him to be here talking about it, for example.
We have another question right here.
Yeah, so I really liked the film. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And the question that, when you asked the question and he got angry, and he was saying, you have something that you want me to say, which he picked up first from his wife, because she was saying that to you too. Like you've got an agenda. And I kept thinking that is the question. That was the unconscious question. That was the shadow question. And any time it would rise up, over all those years, he was pushing it down. He didn't want to face it. He didn't want to go there. So as an interviewer, I have had to do a lot of interviewing. And when you get to those points in somebody that's talking, they become defensive, they become angry. There's such a choice point, like how to get under it, how not to just change the subject. So it was, to me, it was just really skilled as an interviewer and tough, and you only had 4 days. And that man, I wouldn't have been surprised if he had died 2 months after that, because he had to face a lot, and it just really showed to me. I felt it. He went through a metamorphosis in those 4 days. That's just a comment.
Okay, in the back, towards the back.
At the beginning, he was talking about the reason for doing the book. He was talking about being angry at the government and everything. And then towards the end, you showed the parallel between the assassin and the start of World War I. Do you think in any way he was bothered by the fact that his book didn't do something more political, that it was only these sort of senseless killings that didn't inspire?
Oh, that's interesting.
That's interesting, yeah.
That's a great question.
I think that, I don't know what he would have said about that now. I think he continued to harbor, a sense that abuse of power in the hands of the government, or unchecked power in the hands of the government is a danger and an evil and a ever-present one. And so I think, there's a part of him that wanted to continue to defend the book, even as he was distancing himself from it, even then, right? So I think there is a part of him that would have liked the book to have been more of a more of an influential sort of liberal tract that would people would point to in a positive way, I suppose. But I think the recipes, the fact that it was, and the fact that it so clearly advocated violence, and that it was something that he really couldn't, as he talks about, couldn't defend in like the very first press conference that he gave, where he was asked a few questions about advocating violence and whether it was responsible to be putting bomb-making manuals in the hands of people who might, assassinate government officials, blow up buildings, and that sort of thing. And he basically couldn't answer it. I think that part of the book, I think he immediately wanted to distance himself from then, and still did when the film was made. So I would say that I think he continued to harbor sort of anti-government views, but I would say that he pretty quickly realized that the book was flawed, and I don't think he was prepared to defend it then, and certainly, and even when he made that first press conference, he was distancing himself from it.
Yes, right here. Mm-hmm.
So when you had conversations with him, you talked about responsibility, and it's not in the movie. Was there any discussion of the responsibility of the publishers?
Yeah. I mean, there was, but that really revolved around ultimately that opportunity he had to influence the publication of the book. Yes, I mean, we did talk about that. I think, the book does continue to be published by some fourth iteration of the publishing of the publisher that originally published it. But he I think acknowledged that he had an opportunity to stop the publication of the book, and that was a missed opportunity.
Way in the back, yeah.
When you were done with your 4 days of shooting, you drove away from his home. Do you think that you regretted agreeing to your interview?
Well, I continued to talk to Bill for the year after the interviews, and the editing and assembling of the film, and we were getting close to finishing it. He was working on his memoir at the same time and trying to get that published. And we did continue to talk. There was a period shortly after where the conversations were difficult, given how heated things had become during the interviews. But we had gotten past that and kind of continued our conversation. I'm sure there were moments when he, second-guessed and had regrets. I think there are moments during the interviews where you can see that he wishes that he hadn't agreed to do it. But I think ultimately, I think he sensed and trusted that, and I know this because we talked about it, that the portrait would be a fair one, and he did not, and to the extent that he thought that there were questions that were unfair, that would be reflected in the film, and I think it is. I think you have moments in there where I literally say, have you been treated unfairly? And Ochin, his wife, says, I think some of your questions have been leading. And I say, not by me, I mean by others. And I obviously chose to keep that in the film. So, so I think I think a mix, as I would expect nothing less from someone like Bill. He had a mix of reactions. I think he saw the interview as an opportunity. He also saw it as potentially problematic. I think he found the course of the interviews to be helpful and liberating, and I think he also found them to be frustrating and sort of overly and unduly confrontational. And I think he would probably find the film to be, maybe at moments not as generous as it could have been, but ultimately fair. So, do you want to choose this? I think we'll get to everyone, and I'll try to keep my answers
I think we'll get to everyone,
shorter.
yeah, but this is such a great conversation. Yes, let's, right in the back with, yeah, Lynn Ann? I can't recognize people without masks. Sorry about that.
You started at the very start of tonight, but I just wanted to go there again. Like, really, why did he accept your invitation, or how that? I mean, we were talking about like what you, or why you were interested and why he was interested. But to me, for someone to get that kind of, he said a lot of people were calling him, and maybe nobody was lately, and maybe he, but to get that kind of intimacy, there's a trust that has to be built, and I'm just wondering, that's one of my questions. The other question was really why there was so much heat. Was it confrontational? Was he not? He was reticent, like you said, reticent. He was not. You kept asking him questions and he just was not answering them. It's just like, so I don't know if that's where the heat. So it's sort of twofold. Number one, you built this trust, and how did you do that? Just meeting somebody that you didn't know, and then also, why did that, or how did the heat happen, and why?
So I've been asked to repeat the questions, and I'm guessing that's because it's being recorded, and maybe it's hard for the recording or for the streaming. So the two-part question. First, why do I think Bill agreed to do this? What was in it for him? Given that he had turned down other requests, etc.
No, it's not what was in it for him. It's why. How did you build that trust?
Okay, how did I build trust in speaking with Bill to the point where he agreed to be interviewed? And then the second part of the question, now I've forgotten the second part of the question. Oh, why was there so much heat? Why was there so much heat in and questions had to be put to him several times before he would answer them, and he would evade. I would say I think I said before that part of my luck in getting Bill to agree was timing. He had turned down interviews in the past. He had now started to write his memoir. That was just dumb luck that I contacted him at a time. He was 65, he was older, and he was at a point where he was feeling reflective, and I think his health was not great. I know his health was not great around the time that before we filmed. And so, maybe he was feeling motivated in that sense. But as I mentioned, my approach in talking to him about why I was interested in telling his story was I tend to be an over-talker, not an under-talker. I say a lot rather than hiding the ball and saying very little. So I told Bill what I was interested in, why I was interested in his story, what I thought about him, the book. I speculated for him over the phone about what I thought it might have been like for him to have authored this book and to have to sort of grapple with the legacy of it. I spoke in general terms, and I'm sure I did that in a sort of empathetic sounding way. And in that sense, I was making the case for doing the interviews, for why I was interested in it, and I suppose if he liked what he heard or liked how I spoke or my tone, then he thought I might be an empathetic, storyteller for him, an interviewer for him. I also mentioned the John Ronson book when I spoke with him, so I was quite explicit about that. It's not in the film in any way, but I did, I had read it recently and I talked to him about that. So I talked to him about how I thought his story was kind of an early sort of test case of that phenomenon. I think all of those things appealed to him. As for the second part of the question, why things got so heated, I really, I think it's a really difficult subject matter. It's a really difficult story. It's very personal to him. It's a whole lifetime of sort of denial and not wanting to look at this dark chapter. And clearly, he paid an enormous price for it. Throughout his life, and one builds up scar tissue from those sorts of traumas, as I've learned, and he clearly had become practiced at evading and not letting it affect him, or trying to pass it off as if it didn't affect him. And I think he and Ochin talked about that beautifully by the end of the film, late in the film. And so hopefully the heat had a payoff in the end and was worth it. Erica.
I really enjoyed it. About the book that you mentioned, did you think about including that in the film? And my reasoning is, hearing about it after seeing the film, I felt more empathetic towards him, because I felt like it kind of explained his defensiveness if going into the process he thought of himself as a victim who's being vilified for a mistake. So I don't know if you thought about how to picture that.
Yeah, so the question was, did I think about including the book, the John Ronson book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, in some way in the film, and because that might have made him more sympathetic in some way if that had been sort of included, why he might see himself as a victim, yes? I did not think about including the book. I mean, I mean, that's not entirely true. I think by the end, I'm kind of, we're certainly talking about the kinds of kids who resorted to violence, but no, we're not talking about examples of people who publish things and then regret it. That's true. I don't know. I felt like I think it would have been hard to include that ultimately, or I didn't figure out a way to do that, and I wanted to have people kind of take a journey of either liking or not liking Bill on his own terms, I guess. And I feel like it would be kind of tipping the scales, like putting my thumb on the scales if I sort of, framed it that way. I guess if you feel that he's a victim in some way by the end of the film, or that he's been unfairly treated, I want you to get there on your own. And when Bill says, I didn't do it, in that moment of anger, I think you get a window into the kind of that sense of unfairness that he dealt with his whole life. I think that is as revealing as anything about what it would be like to struggle with something that you did when you were 19, and what it's like to have anything that is out of your control kind of come back to haunt you in your own life, or have just any sort of moment of unfairness, of something from your past being used in a way that you can't control. And it's just, I guess I wanted that to just speak on its own terms if that resonates for other people. Yeah, rather than complicate it with that. But I've certainly talked to audiences about it all the time, and I recommend the book. It's a fantastic book.
I think we have, why don't we take one more question, if that's okay, and we'll take one more, and then we can maybe go out and talk for a few more minutes in the lobby.
Sure.
It's a beautiful place out there, so, yeah.
You had a lot of amazing access to footage of his life as a child and with his family, with his own children, his wife, and I'm just wondering, even though he's passed and most likely we get to see the final copy of the film, how his family has reacted to your film.
The question was how Bill's family has reacted to the film, and unfortunately, and because there's access to all of so many old films and stuff, Bill's family and obviously Ochen, his wife, and Bill himself cooperated in the making of the film. Could not have made the film without their participation, and so sadly, Bill's passing prior to the film coming out, I think complicated the reception of the film for family members, and unfortunately, one of the consequences, I think, both of Bill's passing and maybe the sort of unvarnished, warts and all kind of portrait that emerges in the film, I just haven't had feedback from the family. I haven't talked to them about the film, and don't even know if they've seen it. Yeah, that's a downer of a note to end on.
Okay.
No. That's
No,
I did it. Your question was great. I'm happy to chat further in the lobby if people have more questions or just want to tell me what they really thought about the film outside of the glare of the cameras. But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
And thank you again to the VCA for this. And I hope people can make it to Finding Vivian Maier. It's more upbeat. Although
No, we like to be
although it's
crushed.
also dark, there's plenty of dark in there if that's your speed. But anyway, thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Charlie. We're all excited about this possibility, and we want to talk about it some more, the film festival series. So thanks.